I never thought that at 78 I would find myself in this situation. My life was always scheduled to the minute morning coffee, newspaper, walk to the park and back. Even after I retired, I kept that order, as if I were still a clerk in the Somerville County Courthouse, where every document had to be in its proper place. My name is Ebenezer Hawthorne. Most people cringe when they hear my name. Too old-fashioned, they say. My mother, of blessed memory, was a great admirer of classical literature. Perhaps she thought that the name would determine my fate, and I would become an outstanding person. I can't say she was right. 32 years I worked as a court clerk, saw thousands of court cases, from petty theft to murder, watched people lie, dodge, try to cheat the system. Some people think that kind of work must be hardening, but it taught me one thing. In this world, the truth always rises to the surface, no matter how deep they try to drown it. My house has been on Elm Street for 43 years. I bought it when Martha, my wife, was diagnosed with breast cancer. She wanted a house with a garden so she could grow roses. We spent all of our savings on the down payment, but I don't regret a single dime. For 3 years, she enjoyed that garden. For 3 years, I saw her smile every time she looked out the kitchen window at the blooming bushes. After she died, I couldn't bring myself to tend the roses. They withered away that same summer. I was left alone with my 16-year-old son, Calvin. A difficult age compounded by grief. He became withdrawn, distant from me. I tried to reach out to him, but every attempt ended in an argument. Maybe I was being too strict. The habit of order and discipline developed from years in the courtroom is not the best quality for a single father. Calvin started skipping school, got involved with bad company. He even got arrested for disorderly conduct once. "Do you want to go to jail?" I yelled as I picked him up from the police station. "I see people like you in the courtroom every day." "I'm not like them," he snapped at me. "You don't know anything about me. I'm your father." "Father?" His eyes filled with tears. A real father wouldn't judge me. He would have tried to understand. Maybe he was right. I didn't know how to show my feelings. Didn't know how to say that I missed Martha too, that I was hurting too. Instead, I tried to control his life, to fill it with rules and restrictions. No wonder he rebelled. Calvin graduated from high school with mediocre grades. I pushed for college, but he refused. Instead, he got a job at an electronics store. I thought it was a waste of time, but I couldn't get him to change his mind. Our relationship gradually turned into cold politeness. We lived under the same roof, but as if in parallel worlds. When he turned 23, he announced he was moving out. "Where to?" That's all I asked. He rented an apartment with some friends. He shrugged, avoiding my gaze. I helped him pack. We didn't hug goodbye, just shook hands like business partners who'd finalized a bad deal. For 5 years, I only saw him on holidays. Sometimes he called to ask how I was doing, but the conversations were strained, awkward. Then he met Veronica. She worked at the same electronics store in the cash register department, tall with long, straight hair and a confident look. "This is my father, Ebenezer," Calvin introduced me as he brought her into the house. "I'm delighted," she smiled, but her eyes remained cold, assessing. They were married 6 months later. I was at the wedding, sitting in the last row, watching my son make a promise to love and care for a woman I didn't think had any real feelings for him. But it was none of my business. Calvin was an adult capable of making his own decisions. After the wedding, our communication became even more infrequent. Sometimes I'd see them in town, they'd walk by, as if they didn't notice me. Sometimes Calvin called, but our conversations didn't go well. More and more often, I noticed that his voice changed when Veronica was around. It became strained, unnatural. The years passed. I was growing old in my house on Elm Street. The garden was overgrown with weeds. My knees no longer allowed me to work long hours in the beds. The roof was leaking, but I kept putting off repairs. Why spend money on a house you live in alone? I could have sold it, moved to a smaller apartment, but the thought of leaving the place where Martha was happy felt like a betrayal. In January of this year, I felt a pain in my chest. At first, I thought it was just a cold, but when it didn't go away after a week, I went to the doctor. Dr. Price, a young man with attentive eyes, listened to my complaints and ordered an examination. Mr. Hawthorne, you have a serious heart problem," he said, looking at the results. "You need surgery, As soon as possible. Surgery? At my age? I tried to make a joke, but it wasn't very convincing. At your age, people live a full life, he said seriously. But without surgery, I can't make any guarantees. I agreed. Not out of fear of death. At 78, death no longer seems something terrible, but rather an inevitable continuation of the journey. But I wasn't ready to leave without making peace with my son. When I told my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, about the diagnosis, she insisted I call Calvin. You can't be alone right now, Ebenezer, she said, shaking her head. What if you get sick at night? Who will help you? Mrs. Jenkins was a widow like me. She moved into the house across the street after her husband died about 15 years ago. Sometimes she'd bring me home-baked goods, and I'd help her with minor repairs. I wouldn't say we were close friends, but she was the only person who regularly asked how I was doing. I took her advice and called Calvin. The phone rang for a long time, and I was about to hang up when I heard his voice. Dad? Is something wrong? His tone was wary, as if a call from his father could only mean trouble. Calvin, I took a deep breath. I have something important to tell you. I have a heart problem, a serious one. The doctor has scheduled surgery for next week. There was silence on the phone. Then I heard a woman's muffled voice asking something. It's Dad, Calvin answered. He has a heart. Silence again, then a rustle, as if he'd covered the microphone with his hand. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone of their conversation was tense. Dad, are you there? He finally asked. Yeah, Veronica and I are coming tomorrow. You need help. I hadn't expected such a reaction. In all the years since we'd been married, Calvin had never come over for no reason at all. You don't have to worry, I began. I'll be fine. Chia, we'll be there. His voice grew harder. Tomorrow night. He hung up without giving me a chance to object. The next day they did come. Calvin looked gaunt, his dark hair gray at the temples. When did we get so old? Veronica, on the other hand, seemed younger than I remembered. Her hair was dyed copper red, her makeup emphasizing her high cheekbones. Dad, Calvin hugged me, something he hadn't done in years. You should have told me sooner. I didn't mean to bother you, I mumbled, embarrassed by this sudden show of concern. We're a family, Veronica interjected, walking into the house. Of course we have to help each other. I led them into the living room and offered them tea. While I was in the kitchen, I could hear them talking in low voices. When I returned with the tray, Veronica was looking around the room with an appraising eye. It's very nice, she said, but her tone said otherwise. Just a little old-fashioned. Dad doesn't like change, Calvin shrugged. It's just like it was with Mom. Your mom died years ago, Veronica said softly, as if I wasn't in the room. Sometimes you have to move on. I remained silent, pretending not to notice the barb. The evening passed strangely. We talked about the weather, about how grocery prices were rising, about everything but my upcoming surgery. When I did try to discuss the matter, Calvin changed the subject. Veronica and I will stay the night, he announced before dinner, and we'll help you get ready for the hospital. That won't be necessary. Dad, he looked me straight in the eye. I know you're used to doing things on your own, but this is no time to be stubborn. I gave in. Something in his voice told me it was useless to argue. Besides, part of me was glad they were there, despite the strain of the situation. They set up in Calvin's room. It was still untouched since he'd moved out. I went to bed earlier than usual, feeling tired from the strange day. In the morning, coming down for breakfast, I heard them talking in the kitchen. Did you see how much stuff is in here? Veronica's voice sounded excited. This house is like a museum. Quiet, Calvin hissed. He might hear. What difference would it make? He's going to have to move in with us after the surgery anyway. The doctor said he needed care. I coughed as I entered the kitchen, and the conversation stopped. Veronica smiled her fake smile at me. How did you sleep, Mr. Hawthorne? Not bad, thank you, I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. And please call me Ebenezer. The next 2 days passed in intense preparations for hospitalization. Veronica took on the role of housekeeper, going through my things, making lists, telling me what I needed to take to the hospital. Calvin spent most of his time in the living room, staring at his phone. Sometimes I noticed them whispering, but as soon as I got closer, the conversation stopped. The evening before I left for the hospital, I found Veronica in my office. She was going through my desk drawers. What are you doing? I asked, trying to remain calm. She flinched but quickly pulled herself together. I'm looking for your papers, she said, as if nothing had happened, in case I need them at the hospital. My papers are in the top right-hand drawer, I said coldly, and I've already prepared everything I need. Uh-huh. Oh, I'm sorry, she faked embarrassment. I just wanted to help. I didn't sleep well that night. Something about my son and his wife's behavior bothered me, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. Perhaps I was becoming paranoid in my old age. In the morning, Calvin drove me to the hospital. Veronica stayed home to get everything ready for your return, as she explained. I was checked in, examined, and sent to a room. Dr. Gillespie, an elderly heart surgeon with a gray beard, explained the upcoming procedure. We're going to replace the valve and put in 2 stents, Mr. Hawthorne, he said, pointing to a diagram of the heart. The surgery will take about 4 hours. Recovery usually takes 4 to 6 weeks, but a lot depends on your general condition. I understand, I nodded. Do you have someone who can help you after your discharge? He asked, looking at Calvin. Yes, my son answered before I could open my mouth. My wife and I will take care of everything. The doctor nodded, satisfied, and left. Calvin and I were alone in the room. You don't have to stay that long, I said. The surgery isn't until tomorrow morning. I'm in no hurry, he said, sitting down in the chair by the window. We were silent for a while. Then I decided to ask the question that had been on my tongue for a long time. Calvin, why did you and Veronica suddenly decide to help? We hadn't talked normally in years. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, a mixture of guilt, annoyance, and something else. Because you're my father, he said finally, and you're sick. That's it? What other reason would there be? He looked away. We didn't always get along, but you're still my family. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But something in his voice, in the way he avoided looking me in the eye, made me doubt it. A nurse peeked into the room to check my vitals. Calvin took advantage of the moment and announced that he needed to leave. I'll go home, check on Veronica, and be back tonight, he said, getting up. Do you need anything? No thanks, I shook my head. He nodded and walked out without looking back. I lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about my life, about Martha, about our son, about the decisions that had brought me to this hospital room, alone and full of doubt. Thoughts of the upcoming surgery receded into the background, superseded by a strange sense of anxiety. My intuition, nurtured by years of courtroom experience, told me that something was wrong, that there was an ulterior motive behind Calvin and Veronica's actions. But I couldn't figure out what it was. It was starting to get dark outside the window. Calvin never came back. I'd spent the night before surgery without sleep. The sounds of the hospital, the muffled voices of the nurses, the beeping of the monitors, the shuffling of footsteps outside the door blended into a strange symphony that was impossible to escape. Calvin never came back. At one point I reached for the phone, thinking about calling him, but stopped myself. If he didn't want to come, so be it. In the morning I was awakened by a young lab technician coming in to draw blood for a test. He carefully tightened the tourniquet on my arm, finding the vein the first time. Did you sleep well, Mr. Hawthorne? He asked, filling the tubes. Not very well, I admitted. Too many thoughts. That's okay, he nodded. I'm Xavier, by the way. I'll be your lab assistant while you're here. He was a tall, thin guy with a neatly trimmed beard and attentive eyes. His hands moved confidently and accurately. It was obvious that the man knew his business. How old are you, Xavier? I asked to distract myself. 27, he smiled, putting the tubes away in a special container. And you? 78. I guess I must seem ancient to you, I tried to joke. Not at all, he said seriously. My grandfather is 91, and he still fixes his own roof. Lucky for your grandfather, I sighed. Xavier finished his tests and was about to leave, but he stopped in the doorway. You know, Mr. Hawthorne, Dr. Gillespie is the best heart surgeon in Somerville. You're in good hands. Those simple words were strangely comforting. After he left, I felt better. An hour before the operation came the anesthesiologist, a small woman with gray hair, gathered in a tight bundle. She explained the anesthesia procedure and asked a few questions about my health. Then the orderlies showed up with a gurney. One of the nurses stopped at my bedside. Your son didn't come in? She asked. No. I tried to hide my disappointment. Would you like us to call him? Sooner? No. I shook my head. He must have important things to do. I was led down a long corridor, past other rooms, past glass doors with silhouettes of doctors and nurses behind them. In the pre-op room, there were strange machines with screens and tubes. Someone attached sensors to my chest, and an IV needle was inserted into my vein. Count to 10, Mr. Hawthorne, I heard the anesthesiologist's voice. I started counting, but I don't remember if I got to 5. Waking up was painful. My throat was sore from the breathing tube that had already been removed. A dull pain throbbed in my chest. I tried to move my arm and found I was hooked up to an IV. My vision gradually cleared, and I saw Calvin sitting in a chair by the window. He was reading something on his phone, not noticing that I was awake. Calvin, I called out in a husky voice. He flinched, lifting his head. You're awake, he said, no joy in his voice. How was the operation? I said with difficulty. It was fine. The doctor said it was a success. He came closer, but stayed at the foot of the bed, as if he were afraid to come closer. The doctor says you'll need to stay in the hospital for at least a week, he continued, then another month of recuperation at home. Veronica and I discussed it, and at that moment a nurse entered the room, interrupting our conversation. She checked my vitals, wrote something down in my chart. How are you feeling, Mr. Hawthorne? She asked. Like I've been run over by a truck, I answered honestly. That's normal after a surgery like this, she adjusted the IV. The doctor will be here soon to examine you. Calvin stepped aside, letting her pass. When the nurse left, he looked at his watch. I have to go, he said. Veronica's waiting. You just got here, I remarked. I've been here since this morning. He shook his head. You took a long time to recover from the anesthesia. I wanted to ask him why he hadn't come the night before, but I kept silent. I didn't want to start the conversation with complaints. How are things at home? I asked instead. Calvin hesitated, as if searching for words. It's okay. Veronica's organizing, sorting through some old stuff. What kind of stuff? I tensed up. Nothing important, just, junk, old papers. He waved his hand. You know how she likes cleanliness. Something in his tone made me wary, but I was too weak for a serious conversation. Tell her not to touch my papers in my office, I said. There are important papers in there. Of course, he nodded, but his eyes were uncertain. I'll go. I'll be back tomorrow. He left without saying goodbye properly. I was left alone, with an ache in my chest and heavy thoughts. Something was going on in my house. Something Calvin didn't want to talk about. The next 2 days passed in a half-sleep. I'd wake up when the doctors or nurses came in, then fall back into sleep. The medication dulled the pain, but it made my thoughts sluggish. Calvin didn't show up, though he promised he would. On the 3rd day after surgery, I woke up with a clearer head. The pain had subsided a little, and breathing was easier. Xavier was in the room, changing the saline bag on the IV stand. Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne, he smiled. How are you feeling today? Better, I answered, and it was true. Not so sore. That's a good sign, he checked the catheter in my arm. The healing is going well. Dr. Gillespie will be pleased. My son didn't come in? I asked, even though I knew the answer. Xavier shook his head. I haven't seen him, but I'm not here all the time. He finished with the IV and sat down in the chair next to the bed. You know, Mr. Hawthorne, I could call him if you want. No, you don't have to, I sighed. He has a life of his own. Xavier was silent for a moment, then said, My father wasn't very involved in my life either. After he divorced my mom, he hardly ever showed up. And then, when I grew up, he suddenly decided he wanted to be a part of my life. And what did you do? I asked, surprised by this sudden revelation. I pushed him away at first. Thought, why do I need him now that I've done it on my own? And then, I realized life was too short for resentment. He smiled a sad smile. We didn't become best friends, but we have a normal relationship now. Sometimes we meet for dinner and talk. You're lucky, I remarked. Maybe, he stood up. I should go. The other patients are waiting. After he left, I stared out the window for a long time, thinking about Xavier's words. Maybe the disease would give Calvin and I a chance to bond. But then why doesn't he come? By the evening of the 5th day, I was able to sit up on my own and even get out of bed briefly. A nurse helped me to the bathroom and back, a small accomplishment I was somehow proud of. The doctors said the recovery was going faster than they expected. In the evening, Calvin and Veronica came in unexpectedly. She was holding a basket of fruit, which she placed on the nightstand as if she had performed an unpleasant duty. "How are you, Daddy?" Calvin asked, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "Better," I answered. "The doctors say I'm recovering fast." "That's good," he nodded, but I didn't hear joy in his voice. Veronica stood at the window, tapping her foot impatiently. "There's something we wanted to talk to you about," Calvin continued. "When you get discharged, you're going to need care. We think you should move in with us. Temporarily, of course." "Why?" I wondered. "I'll do just fine on my own." "Ebenezer," Veronica intervened, coming closer. "You can't stay alone after an operation like this. You need constant care, supervision." "Mrs. Jenkins has agreed to look in on me," I countered, "and I can hire a nurse for a few hours a day, if necessary." Calvin and Veronica exchanged glances. "Dad, you have to understand," Calvin put his hand on my shoulder. "Your house has too many stairs, too many thresholds. It's dangerous for a man in your condition." "I know my house better than anyone." I felt the irritation rising inside me. "And I've lived in it for 43 years without a problem." "But you've never had heart surgery before," Calvin said softly. I looked at them, the son and his wife, both with a look of concern on their faces. But their eyes betrayed their impatience, and Veronica's was a poorly concealed irritation. "Thank you for the offer," I said firmly, "but I'm going back to my house." Veronica pressed her lips into a thin line, and Calvin sighed with obvious disappointment. "All right," he said at last, "but we insist that you not be alone, at least for the first time. Maybe Veronica could stay with you for a week until you're stronger." "Natin." "What?" Veronica's staring at her husband. "We haven't discussed—" "It's the best compromise," Calvin interrupted her. "You said yourself that it's off-season at the store, and you have time." She was silent, clearly displeased. I watched the spectacle and sensed something was wrong. Why would they be so insistent that I not be alone in my house? "You don't have to," I said. "I'll get a nurse." "Shakana, caregivers are expensive," Veronica countered quickly. "We're a family, and we have to help each other." Her words sounded fake, like a learned phrase. "I can afford a caregiver," I said. "I have savings." Again, that strange exchange of looks between them. Calvin coughed. "Dad, don't be so stubborn. We just want to help." "And I appreciate that," I nodded. "But I'm used to solving my own problems. It's always been that way." The conversation was clearly at an impasse. Veronica looked at her watch and reminded Calvin that they had to go. "We're only here for a little while," he explained, getting up. "But we'll come back to this conversation." "Sure," I smiled, trying to look friendly. "Thanks for stopping by." After they left, I lay staring at the ceiling for a long time, trying to figure out what was going on. Why would they be so insistent that I move out, or at least not be alone? And why hadn't Calvin told me how things were going in the house? Why hadn't he told me what Veronica was sorting out? They didn't show up for the next 3 days. I was gradually gaining strength, able to walk down the hallway on my own, sit in a chair for hours. Xavier came by every day, sometimes just to chat. He told me about his studies. It turned out he was working at the hospital to pay for medical school. On the 8th day after the surgery, Dr. Gillespie visited me. He carefully examined the suture, listened to my heart, and checked my test results. "You're recovering remarkably fast, Mr. Hawthorne," he said, removing his stethoscope. "Frankly, I didn't expect such progress at your age." "So I'll be able to go home soon?" I asked. "Sanarari, a couple more days of observation, and if there are no complications, we'll let you go." The doctor nodded. "But you'll need care. Someone will have to be around for a while." "I'll get a nurse," I assured him. "And I have a neighbor who has agreed to help." Dr. Gillespie nodded, but there was doubt in his eyes. "What about your son? Can he help?" "He's got his own life," I shrugged. "I don't want to be a burden." That evening, Xavier came in. He wasn't in his work uniform, but jeans and a sweater. "My shift is over," he explained, noticing my surprised look. "But I wanted to see how you were doing." "The doctor says I'll be out soon," I replied. "In 2 days." "That's great news." He was genuinely pleased. "You have an amazing ability to recover." For an old man, you mean?" I grinned. "For any man," he replied seriously. "Believe me, I've seen a lot of things around here." We talked a little longer, and then he was about to leave, but he stopped at the door. "Mr. Hawthorne, I don't mean to pry, but, your son and his wife, do they visit you often?" "Not very much." I tried to hide the bitterness in my voice. "They have their own business." "I understand," he nodded. "It's just, I thought it was strange. They were talking to Dr. Gillespie in the hallway yesterday. I happened to overhear part of the conversation. They were asking how much longer you'd be in the hospital." I got tense. "And what did the doctor say?" "That you were recovering faster than expected and would be able to go home soon?" Xavier frowned. They looked unhappy with the news. This information confirmed my suspicions. Something wasn't right. "Wait, Chummy, thanks for telling me," I thanked him. The next day, Calvin and Veronica didn't show up, but they did call. The conversation was short and strained. They asked how I was feeling, talked about some business with the house, but when I tried to get more specifics, they changed the subject. In the evening, I decided to call Mrs. Jenkins to make sure that she would really be able to help me after I was discharged. "Ebenezer, I'm so glad to hear your voice," she exclaimed. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you," I replied. "I'm going to be discharged soon, and I was wondering." "Oh, I was so worried," she interrupted, "especially when I saw them taking things out of your house. I thought something terrible had happened." I froze. "What do you mean they're taking things out?" "Your son and his wife," she explained. "They've been loading the car with boxes for days on end." "I thought you knew." My heart clenched, and this time it wasn't from physical pain. "No," I answered quietly. "I don't know." Mrs. Jenkins must have heard something in my voice, because her tone changed immediately. "Ebenezer, what's going on? They said they're taking things into storage while you're in the hospital. Is that not true?" "Not exactly," I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. "Look, Eleanor, could you do me a favor? Keep an eye on my house. And if you see anything strange, call me." "Of course, darling," she promised. "I'll be on the lookout." After I talked to her, I couldn't calm down for a long time. What are they doing in my house? Why were they taking things out? And why were they so insistent that I should not go back there alone? The next morning, Dr. Gillespie announced that I could be discharged in a day if my vitals remained stable. I thanked him and immediately called Calvin to break the news. "That's great, Dad," he said, but there was no joy in his voice. "Veronica and I are going to pick you up and take you to our place. We're all set." "Calvin, I told you I'm going back to my house," I said firmly. "But Dad—" "No buts," I interrupted him. "It's my decision." He stopped talking, then said quietly, almost in a whisper, "Maybe it's not such a good idea." "Why not?" "Just trust me, okay?" His voice sounded strange. "It would be better if you stayed with us. Just for a couple weeks." "Calvin, what's going on?" I was starting to lose my patience. "What are you doing in my house? Mrs. Jenkins saw you taking things out." Silence again, then a deep sigh. "We're just, cleaning," he finally said. "There's so much junk that's accumulated over the years. We wanted to surprise you with a clean, cozy house when we got back." I didn't believe a word of it. Mrs. Jenkins talked about boxes that had been taken out for days on end. How much junk could there be in a house I'd kept in order all these years? "I'm coming home," I repeated, "and I want all my stuff in its place when I get there. Everything, Calvin, every single piece of paper." "Dad, listen." "No, you listen to me." I raised my voice, something I hadn't done in years. "I don't know what you guys are up to, but this is my house, and I'm going back there the day after tomorrow, whether you like it or not." I hung up the phone, feeling my heart pounding. Maybe I shouldn't have been so nervous after the surgery, but I couldn't help it. Something told me I needed to get home as soon as possible, so I decided not to wait until the day after tomorrow. I would be discharged tomorrow, even if I had to sign a waiver for further treatment. I talked to Dr. Gillespie this morning. He wasn't thrilled with my decision to check out early, but after examining me and analyzing the results, he reluctantly agreed. "Technically, I can't keep you here," he said as he reviewed my chart. "Your condition is stable, but I'd prefer you stay another day for observation." "I have urgent business at home," I insisted. and I promised to follow all the instructions. He sighed and signed the discharge papers, but made me promise that I would come in for checkups and see a doctor immediately if I felt worse. While the paperwork was being processed, I called a cab service. I decided not to call Calvin. I didn't want to hear any more objections and excuses. Besides, after last night's conversation, I was sure he'd try to stop me from going home. The nurse helped me pack my things and walk me to the exit. Xavier was there waiting for me. He was in his work uniform, but apparently he'd come to say goodbye. "I hear you're checking out today," he smiled. "Decided to get away from us early?" "I missed home," I said, shaking his hand. "Thanks for everything, Xavier." "You're welcome, Mr. Hawthorne." He helped me into the cab. "Good luck to you. And if you need anything, you have my number." I nodded, grateful for his concern. Xavier had become closer to me than my own son over the days. The cab drove down the familiar streets of Somerville. It was a clear, sunny spring day, the first real warm day after a long winter. People were walking around in light jackets, and the parks were green with fresh grass. It's strange how the perception of the world changes after meeting with death. Everything around seems brighter, more significant. When the car turned onto Elm Street, I immediately noticed that something was wrong. Usually at this time of day, the neighbors were out in their gardens. Mrs. Jenkins liked to tinker with her flowers. Mr. Parker across the street often worked in his garage. But now the street was deserted. Only Calvin's car was parked outside my house. "So, stop here, please," I asked the driver before I reached the house. After I paid, I walked slowly toward the house, feeling my heart pounding. Something told me to be careful. I stopped at the gate, looking at my house, a two-story house with a white veranda and a shabby roof that should have been fixed long ago. The curtains on the windows were drawn, though I always left them open during the day. I pushed open the gate. It was unlocked, slowly, trying not to make any noise. I walked down the path to the house. When I got to the porch, I took out my keys and tried to put them in the lock. The key wouldn't go in. I tried again, then again. No use. The lock was replaced. At that moment, the door opened abruptly. On the threshold stood Veronica, in her robe, with a glass of water in her hand. When she saw me, she froze with her mouth open. "Ebenezer," her voice trembled. Have you checked out yet?" "As you can see," I tried to speak calmly. "Why did you change the locks?" She pulled herself together quickly, straightening up. "For safety," she said. "After there was a burglary on the next block, we decided to—" "Calvin!" she shouted into the back of the house. "Come here." I heard hurried footsteps, and a moment later my son appeared. He was pale, his eyes running, avoiding my gaze. "Dad?" He smiled strainedly. "We weren't expecting you so early. Why didn't you call?" "I was trying to put the key in the lock of my own house," I said, feeling my anger rising, "and found that the locks had been changed, without my knowledge." Calvin looked at Veronica, then nodded as if making a decision. "Dad, we need to talk," he said. "Come in." I stepped across the threshold, and I was greeted by unfamiliar surroundings. Many things had been rearranged, some were gone. The pictures of Martha that had always been on the mantel were gone. In place of my old couch was a new leather one. "What's going on here?" and I asked, looking around. "Where are my things?" "Sit down, please." Calvin pointed to the new couch. "There's something we need to talk about." I remained standing. I asked, "Where are my things?" Veronica pressed his lips together. "We got rid of the junk. This house needed some updating." "Junk?" I couldn't believe my ears. It was my stuff, my memories. "Dad, calm down." Calvin held up his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "You just got out of surgery, you can't worry." "I'm calm," I said, though I was seething inside. "Just explain what's going on here." Calvin took a deep breath and then looked at Veronica. She nodded at him. "Dad," he began, "Veronica and I have wanted to buy a house for a long time, but prices are so... Anyway, when you got sick, we thought, considering your age and your condition, we decided that it would be wise to transfer the house to us." Veronica intervened. "We'd inherit it in the future anyway. And this way, we'd avoid inheritance taxes." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You remortgaged my house? Without my consent?" "Arhankon. We were acting in your best interest. Calvin avoided my gaze. You were in the hospital. The doctors made no guarantees. The house isn't yours anymore, Ebenezer, Veronica said bluntly. It's ours now. Legally. That's impossible. I shook my head. I hadn't signed any papers. Veronica smiled a cold, calculating smile. Actually, you did. Remember before you were hospitalized, you signed the paperwork for the hospital. There were other papers. I remembered signing some papers when Calvin had distracted me by talking about health insurance. Was there a contract for the sale of the house among them? It's fraud, I said, feeling the blood drain from my face. You cheated me. Call it what you want, Veronica shrugged. But the paperwork is correct. The house is ours. Calvin looked embarrassed, but he didn't argue with his wife. Dad, we're not kicking you out, he said. You can live with us. We've made all the arrangements. Stay with you? I couldn't believe my ears. In the house you stole from me? We didn't steal it, Veronica objected. It's all legal. We have the papers. She walked over to the secretary, my secretary that had stood in the living room for years, and pulled out a folder of papers. Here, take a look. She handed me the papers. It's all official, notarized. I took the papers with shaking hands. Indeed, there was a contract of sale, my signatures on every page. I never signed that contract. Someone forged my signature. But how to prove it? It's a forgery, I said, handing back the documents. I never signed the contract to sell the house. The notary thinks otherwise, Veronica replied coldly. And the court will believe us too. Not an old man with heart problems and possibly memory problems. I looked at Calvin. My son was standing there, his eyes downcast, clearly unable to meet my gaze. You let her do it, I told him. You let her deceive your father. Dad, understand, he finally looked up. We meant well. You don't need such a big house at your age. You're going to live with us. We're going to take care of you. Liar, I interrupted him. You're both liars and cheats, and I'm not going to put up with it. I'm afraid you don't have a choice. Veronica crossed her arms over her chest. The house is ours, and if you don't want to live with us, you can look for another place to live. I looked at both of them, the woman with the cold eyes and my son, who'd betrayed me for her. You can't just kick me out like that, I said. I will fight. Hakum, as you wish, Veronica shrugged. But you'd better leave tonight. We've already started renovations, and it's going to be noisy and dusty. It's bad for your health. I'm not going anywhere, I said firmly. This is my home. Calvin, Veronica turned to her husband. Explain the situation to your father. I'll go make some tea. She went into the kitchen, leaving the two of us alone. Calvin looked confused but quickly pulled himself together. Dad, please don't make this any harder than it has to be, he said quietly. Veronica's right. Legally, the house is ours now. If you resist, she'll call the police. The police? I couldn't believe my ears. You're going to let your wife call the police on your father? I don't want that, he rubbed his face with his hands. But she's determined, and the paperwork's really on our side. You know I never signed that contract, I looked him straight in the eye. You know it's a fraud. He looked away. Look, Dad, his voice sounded tired. Maybe you just forgot. You know, at your age, your memory can be a little fuzzy. Don't you dare, I interrupted him. Don't you dare say I'm out of my mind. I remember every document I ever signed, and the agreement to sell the house wasn't one of them. Calvin sighed. What do you want me to say? The deeds are done. The house is ours. You can live with us if you want, or find another place to live. It's your choice. I looked at my son, the son I'd raised alone after Marta died, the boy I taught to ride a bike, the boy I read books to at bedtime. How could he do this to me? I'll go, I finally said. But don't think I'll give up. I'll prove that you're crooks. He didn't answer, only nodded, as if he expected such a reaction. Can I at least take my personal belongings? I asked. Sure. He pointed to a small bag in the corner. We'd already packed the essentials. I walked over and opened the bag. There were a few shirts, pants, underwear, toiletries, and a photo album, the only personal item they had seen fit to leave me. Where are my papers? I asked. Passport? Insurance? Bank statements? They're in a safe place, Calvin answered. We'll keep them for you. Give me my papers, and I demanded. Now. He hesitated, then left the room. He came back a minute later with an envelope. Here, he handed me the envelope. Here's my passport and health insurance. The rest, Veronica had already sent it to the bank to update the information. I took the envelope, checked the contents. Indeed, the passport and insurance were there. But where are the bank cards? Savings book? Retirement papers? Calvin, where are my financial documents? I asked, feeling panic rising inside. Veronica's dealing with it. He averted his eyes. Everything will be fine, don't worry. At that moment, I realized that they hadn't just stolen my house. They were trying to gain control of all my assets. Taking advantage of my illness, they decided to appropriate everything I had. Get out, came Veronica's harsh voice from the doorway. The house isn't yours anymore. Get out. Calvin flinched, but didn't contradict his wife. I looked at them both, feeling my heart clench with pain, and not physical pain, much deeper. You're my son, I said to Calvin. How could you? Dad, please. He started, but I'd already turned toward the door. You're going to regret this, I said, gripping the handle. Both of you. I walked outside, feeling my legs shaking. The sun was still shining, but the world around me seemed to have faded. I walked slowly down the path without looking back, though each step was worth the effort. Mrs. Jenkins was standing at the gate. From the look on her face, she had heard at least part of the conversation through the open windows. Ebenezer, she came up to me, looking anxiously into my face. What's the matter? You look terrible. They stole my house, Eleanor. I could barely hold back my tears. My own son and his wife, she gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. My God, but how? Forged documents, I shook my head. They took advantage of the fact that I was in the hospital. It's horrible, she took my hand. What are you going to do? I don't know, I said honestly. First, we have to find a place to stay. You could stay at my place, she offered without hesitation. I have a spare room. Thank you, Eleanor, but I don't want to drag you into this, I smiled weakly. They could be dangerous. I'll find a motel nearby. At least let me drive you, she insisted. You can barely stand on your feet. I agreed, and she helped me to her car. On the way to the motel, I told her everything that had happened. She listened, shaking her head with indignation. We should go to the police, she said firmly. This is fraud. I should consult a lawyer first, I replied. They have forged documents. Everything looks legit. I need proof of fraud. The Pine Grove Motel was on the outskirts of Somerville, a small one-story building with a row of doors leading out to the parking lot. Eleanor insisted on paying for the first night. I know you'll pay it back, she said, waving away my objections. Right now you need to rest. I'll stop by in the morning and bring breakfast. Alone in a featureless room with faded wallpaper and a creaky bed, I finally let myself realize what had happened. My son, my own flesh and blood, had kicked me out of my own home, the house I'd bought for his mother, where he'd grown up. How could he do that? I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through my contacts. Who could I call? Who could help in a situation like this? Most of my friends were long dead or moved away. Colleagues from work. Who did I keep in touch with after I retired? And then I thought of Malcolm Pierce. We had worked together at the courthouse for over 20 years. He was an associate judge, and then when he retired, he went into legal advice. We hadn't spoken to each other for a few years, but we used to be good friends. I found his number and, after hesitating, pressed the call button. After a few beeps, I heard a familiar voice. Pierce here. Malcolm, this is Ebenezer Hawthorne, I said. I'm sorry to bother you, but I need your help. Ebenezer, he sounded surprised. How many years? How many winters? What happened? I briefly explained the situation. Malcolm listened, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he whistled. What a story. So they forged your signature on the sales contract? I'm sure they did, I confirmed. I've never signed such a document. It's a serious crime, he said thoughtfully. Forgery, fraud, perhaps even financial abuse of an elderly person. What should I do, Malcolm? I asked. I have no proof. We need to act quickly, he said firmly. First, we secure your finances. We'll go to the bank in the morning, block all the accounts. Then we'll go to the notary who certified the documents. Maybe he was in cahoots or he was cheated too. And of course, we need to file a police report. Do you think I have any chance of getting my house back? If we can prove that the signature is forged, definitely, he answered confidently. Besides, there's another aspect. You've just had an operation. You were under medication. Even if you had signed the documents, you could challenge them by proving that you were not able to realize the consequences of your actions. His words gave me hope. I wasn't a helpless victim. I had a path to justice. Thank you, Malcolm, I said. I can't thank you enough. It's nothing, he said. We're friends. Besides, I've always hated crooks, especially those who take advantage of their own family. We agreed to meet in the morning. After the conversation, I felt energized. Yes, I've been cheated, kicked out of my own home, but I won't give up. I've been in court for 32 years. I've seen how the justice system works. Now that system will be on my side. I lay on the hard motel bed, staring at the ceiling. Cars rumbled outside the window, an ambulance siren cutting through the evening air somewhere in the distance. I thought about Calvin, about how he'd changed under Veronica's influence. Or maybe he'd always been this way, and I didn't want to see it. Bitterness and frustration fought in me with determination. I closed my eyes, trying to calm down and gather my thoughts. Tomorrow would begin a new phase in my life, a fight for justice, for the return of what was rightfully mine. And I was ready for that fight, despite my age and recent surgery. They'd find out that old court clerk Ebenezer Hawthorne wasn't so easy to fool. Malcolm arrived at the motel early in the morning in his tattered Toyota. He hadn't changed much over the years. The same neat gray beard, the same intelligent eyes behind his thin-rimmed glasses. Only there were more wrinkles on his face. "You look pretty good for a man who's just been kicked out of his own house," he said, shaking my hand. "I'm trying to keep it together," I said. "Thanks for coming, Malcolm." He nodded and got right to the point. "I've drawn up a plan of action. First, we go to the bank, block your accounts. Then we go to the notary to find out who authorized these documents. After that, we file a police report. What do you think?" "Sounds reasonable," I agreed. "But there's a problem. I'm not sure I can prove the signature was forged. They might claim that I simply forgot to sign the documents." "I've thought about that too," Malcolm smiled. "I know an handwriting expert. He can compare the signatures and determine whether they're real or not. But to do that, we'd need copies of the documents." "I don't have them," I sighed. "Veronica showed me the originals, but she wouldn't let me make copies." "That's okay." Malcolm was unfazed. "Copies of the contracts are kept at the notary's office and at the registration office. We'll get them." His confidence gave me strength. We got into the car and headed for the bank. On the way, I told more about the events of the last few days, about Calvin and Veronica's strange behavior, about how they had taken things from the house while I was in the hospital. At the bank, we were greeted by a young female employee with a polite smile. I showed my passport and explained that I wanted to block all my accounts. "May I know the reason?" she asked, looking at the computer screen. "I suspect fraud," I replied. "Someone is trying to access my funds without my consent." She nodded as she continued typing something into the computer. Then she frowned. "Mr. Hawthorne, there's been a change in your accounts. A second holder was added 3 days ago, Veronica Hawthorne, and yesterday a significant amount of money was withdrawn from the account." I felt my heart sink. "What kind of withdrawals?" "Freddie, $50,000 were withdrawn from the savings account, $8,000 from the current account." Malcolm put his hand on my shoulder, sensing my condition. "Mr. Hawthorne did not authorize the addition of a second holder," he told the employee, "and he didn't withdraw that money. We want to block all accounts and file a fraud report." "You need to speak to a manager," she said after a pause. "Please wait." While she went to get the manager, I sat clutching the armrests of my chair. $58,000 was the bulk of my savings. The money I'd been saving all my life was gone in one day. The manager, a full middle-aged man, listened carefully to our story. "We need documentation that you didn't authorize the addition of a second holder," he said. "A police report, for example." "We're just about to file that," Malcolm replied. "For in the meantime, block the accounts to prevent further withdrawals." The manager hesitated but finally agreed. We filled out the necessary forms and the accounts were blocked. But it was not so easy to get back the money already withdrawn. "You have to prove that the money was withdrawn without your knowledge," the manager explained. "This can take time." As I left the bank, I felt a mixture of anger and despair. Calvin and Veronica had not only stolen my house, they had also robbed me of my livelihood. Don't despair, Malcolm read my mind. We'll get your money back, and we'll get your house back. It just takes time and patience. The next stop was the notary's office, which certified the sale contract. It turned out to be a small office on the edge of town. The notary, Mrs. Prentice, a thin woman with a short haircut, greeted us warily. "What can I do for you?" she asked when we introduced ourselves. "I'd like a copy of the deed to my house that you certified last week," I said. "The house is on Elm Street, 32. She checked the records on the computer, then nodded. "Yes, I certified that contract, but I can only give a copy to the parties to the transaction." "I am a party to the transaction," I objected. "Ebenezer Hawthorne, the seller." Mrs. Prentice looked at me carefully. "It's strange. I don't remember you. There was a woman who brought the papers. She introduced herself as your sister-in-law and said you were in the hospital and couldn't come in person." I looked at Malcolm. It was an important testimony. "And you certified the documents without my presence?" I asked incredulously. Mrs. Prentice looked embarrassed. "She provided a power of attorney on your behalf. It was properly executed." "May I see that power of attorney?" I asked. She checked the records again, then pulled a folder out of the closet. It contained the purchase agreement and a power of attorney supposedly signed by me. "That's not my signature," I said, looking at the document. "I never signed that power of attorney." Mrs. Prentice turned pale. "But I checked the documents. Everything looked legitimate." "I'm afraid you've been deceived," Malcolm interjected. "Mr. Hawthorne was in the hospital after heart surgery and had not signed any power of attorney. His son and daughter-in-law took advantage of the situation and forged the documents." "That's a serious accusation," Mrs. Prentice's voice trembled. "If it's true, I could lose my license." "Moira, we don't want to get you in trouble," Malcolm assured her. "We just need copies of the documents to prove the forgery." After much persuasion and explanation, Mrs. Prentice agreed to make us copies of all the documents related to the sale of the house. In addition, she wrote a statement that she had not personally seen me sign the documents, but certified them on the basis of the power of attorney provided by Veronica Hawthorne. "That's an important piece of evidence," Malcolm said as we left the office. "Now we have proof that you were not personally involved in the transaction." The next stop was the police station. I filed a report for fraud, forgery, and theft. The officer taking the report was young and a bit bored, but he took careful note of all the details. "We will investigate," he said at the end. "Summer, but I must warn you, these cases are hard to prove, especially when it comes to family relationships." "We have proof," Malcolm objected. "The notary's statement, medical documents proving that Mr. Hawthorne was in the hospital at the time of the transaction." The officer nodded, but it was obvious he wasn't too impressed. "I'll turn the case over to the detective. He'll be in touch with you." Walking out of the station, I felt tired. Too much going on for a man who had recently undergone heart surgery. "You need to rest," Malcolm said, noticing my condition. "Let's go back to the motel." "No," I shook my head. "We just started. We need to keep going." "Ebenezer, we already have important evidence. The rest can wait till tomorrow." "What if they destroy the evidence by tomorrow?" I objected. "Or disappear with my money?" Malcolm sighed, but agreed to continue. Our next visit was to see an expert penmanship expert he knew, Professor Ramirez, who worked at a local college. The professor turned out to be an energetic man in his 60s, with thick gray hair and lively eyes. He scrutinized the copies of the documents, comparing the signatures on the contract and power of attorney with samples of my real signature, which I had left on several blank sheets of paper. "Forgery," he said confidently after half an hour of study, and not a very skillful one at that. "You see these uncertain lines? It's a characteristic of imitating someone else's handwriting. Can you give an official opinion?" Malcolm asked. "Of course," the professor nodded. "But for a court of law, we'll need a more detailed examination with the original documents." "That can be organized later," Malcolm agreed. "Shanawam. In the meantime, your preliminary report will be very useful." The professor drew up a document in which he stated his opinion that the signatures on the sales contract and the power of attorney did not match my handwriting and were probably forgeries. By evening, we had a solid folder of documents proving Calvin and Veronica's fraud, but Malcolm insisted that wasn't enough. Adesanyinorim. We need to find something else, he said as we ate dinner at a small diner near the motel. Something that will completely undermine their credibility in the eyes of the court. What do you suggest? I asked, stirring the cooled coffee. I have an idea. Malcolm leaned closer. Do you remember Gordon McPherson? He worked in the prosecutor's office when we were in court. Vaguely, I admitted. Tall, red-haired? That's right. He works for a federal agency now. Financial crimes. I could have him look into your sister-in-law. If she's involved in fraud with your house, it might not be her first time. The idea seemed promising. I agreed, and Malcolm immediately called his contact. Gordon promised to help and call back as soon as he found something. The next morning, we continued collecting evidence. Malcolm contacted the hospital and obtained official confirmation that I was being treated there at the time of the alleged transaction. We also visited the registry office where we obtained a copy of the registered sales contract. When we returned to the motel, we found a note pinned to the room door. Call me back urgently, Gordon. Malcolm immediately dialed his number and put it on speakerphone. I have some interesting news, and Gordon said after a brief greeting. I ran your Veronica Hawthorne, maiden name Santos. And guess what? 5 years ago, a certain Veronica Santos was the subject of a real estate fraud case in Oregon. I straightened up in my chair, feeling my pulse quicken. What's the case? Malcolm asked. She worked in a real estate office and forged documents for the sale of old people's houses. The scheme was simple. She found lonely old people, gained their trust, and then somehow got their signatures on the real estate sale documents. In 2 cases, the victims died shortly after the transactions, which aroused suspicion. But it was impossible to prove anything. Too little evidence, no witnesses. The case was closed, but she's still in the system. Is there a picture of this Veronica Santos? I asked. We need to make sure it's the same woman. Oh, sure, I'll email it to you. But be warned, this is confidential information. Officially, I have not told you anything. A few minutes later, a photo opened up on Malcolm's laptop. There was no doubt about it. It was Veronica, 5 years younger, with a different hairstyle, but definitely her. Now that's her, I confirmed, my sister-in-law. In that case, Gordon's voice became serious. You have a much stronger case than you thought. This is no longer just a family conflict, but part of a systematic criminal enterprise. I can contact the local authorities so they can give your case special attention. That would be very helpful, Malcolm thanked him. But we need proof that this information was obtained legally. I understand, Gordon agreed. I'll make an official request. It will take a few days, but the result will be the same. The information about your daughter-in-law's past will become part of the case. After the conversation with Gordon, Malcolm and I discussed strategy for a long time. Now that we had information about Veronica's past, a lot of things made sense. She was looking for another victim, I said, and she found it in Calvin or, more accurately, in me. The question was whether Calvin knew about her past. Probably not, Malcolm shook his head. From what you've told me, he's the wingman in this relationship. Veronica is manipulating him, using his resentment toward you. It sounded plausible. I remembered how Calvin's voice changed when Veronica was around, how he avoided looking me in the eye when he lied. But why now? I wondered aloud. They'd been married for years. Why did she decide to act now? Your illness, Malcolm answered without hesitation. Heart surgery at your age is a serious matter. She probably hoped you wouldn't survive, or at least would be too weak to resist. The thought was horrible but logical. I remembered Veronica taking pictures of my paperwork before I was hospitalized, how she and Calvin had seemed surprised and even displeased when they found out about my quick recovery. We need to gather more evidence, I decided, especially about what they were doing while I was in the hospital. Maybe the neighbors saw something. Good idea, Malcolm agreed. Mrs. Jenkins had already confirmed that they'd taken things out of the house. Maybe the other neighbors saw something too. The next day we drove around to the neighbors on Elm Street. Many of them had known me for years and were outraged when they heard what was going on. Mr. Parker said he saw Calvin and Veronica loading boxes into the car late at night, acting very stealthily. Mrs. Lewis, who lived 2 houses down from me, recalled seeing an unfamiliar man enter my house with Veronica when Calvin was gone. He was dressed formally, carrying a briefcase, and she said, "I thought it was some kind of lawyer or notary." All these testimonies were carefully recorded. The neighbors agreed to testify if necessary. By the end of the week, we had a solid evidentiary base. The notary's statement, the opinion of an expert scribe, medical documents confirming my stay in the hospital, neighbors' testimonies, information about Veronica's past machinations. Gordon kept his promise and made an official request that allowed us to legally include this information in the case. But our most important piece of evidence came by accident. Malcolm offered to set up surveillance on my house to record Calvin and Veronica's actions. We hired a private detective, an ex-cop, who set up a directional microphone and camera in front of the house. On the third day of surveillance, the detective recorded Calvin and Veronica talking in the backyard. They didn't suspect they might be overheard and spoke openly. "Sir, we need to sell the house as soon as possible," Veronica said, "before the old man finds a way to get it back." "But we just moved in," Calvin objected. "Why sell?" "Because your father isn't as simple as he looks," she said irritably. "He used to work in court. He might have connections. If he can prove we forged the documents, we could go to jail." "You promised that everything would be legal." There was fear in Calvin's voice. "Nah, you said the power of attorney was real." "Shut up and listen," Veronica hissed. "We're selling the house, taking the money and leaving. To another state, maybe even another country. We're starting over." "What about Dad?" Calvin objected weakly. "Forget about him," Veronica said. "He's an old man. He won't last much longer. We'll have a new life, new opportunities." That tape was the final nail in the coffin of their fraud. The confession of forgery, the plans to flee, it was all recorded and could be used in court. When I heard the tape, I was overcome with contradictory feelings. On the one hand, I was glad that we now had irrefutable evidence. On the other hand, Calvin's words that the power of attorney had to be real showed that my son may not have fully realized the extent of the crime. Veronica was manipulating him just as Malcolm suspected. "How do you feel?" Malcolm asked when the tape ended. "Sadness," I answered honestly, "and determination. I want my house and my money back. But most of all, I want Veronica to answer for everything she's done, not just to me, but to the other victims." "It's going to happen," Malcolm said confidently. "Haha, we have enough evidence to not only get your house back, but to prosecute them." "Them?" I questioned. "Or just Veronica?" Malcolm looked at me understandingly. "That's for you to decide, Ebenezer. Calvin was in on the fraud too, but maybe not fully aware of the consequences. If you want to give him a chance to make amends." I was silent for a long time, weighing my options. Then I made a decision. No. Calvin's a grown man. He could have stopped Veronica. He could have warned me. But he chose money over his own father. Let him answer for his actions. Malcolm nodded without arguing. He knew my decision wasn't easy. "Tomorrow we'll turn over all the evidence to the detective," he said, "and we'll start the process of getting your property back. Prepare yourself. It won't be easy. They'll resist, maybe even try to escape, but we won't let them." I nodded, feeling strangely calm. Over the course of this week, I had gone from despair to determination, from helplessness to action. I was no longer the victim, I was the hunter, and my prey had no idea that he was about to be trapped. The morning was clear and cool. I stood at the motel window, watching the first rays of sunlight color the sky a soft pink. Today was the day I'd been waiting for all week, a day of restorative justice. There was a knock on the door. Malcolm arrived exactly at the appointed time, 7:30 in the morning. He was followed by Detective Foster, the man we'd given all the evidence to, a sturdy man with an alert gaze and confident movements. "Ready?" Malcolm asked, shaking my hand. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, picking up the file folder from the desk. Detective Foster briefly explained the plan of action. Judge Ramirez signed the search warrant and temporary restraining order. Police officers are already waiting for us 2 blocks from your house. We're going to show your son and his wife identification, search for evidence, then detain them for questioning. Are you ready for that? I nodded. I had visualized this moment many times over the past week, running different scenarios through my head. I was ready to face Calvin and Veronica, ready to see their reaction when they realized their plan had failed. We got into the detective's car and headed toward Elm Street. On the way, I looked at the familiar streets of Somerville, the people rushing to work, the kids walking to school. An ordinary day for them, but for me, a moment of truth. At the corner of Elm Street, we met up with police officers, two uniformed patrolmen, and another plainclothes detective. Foster briefed them, showed them the warrant. Then we walked together toward my house. I walked ahead, feeling a strange mixture of determination and anxiety. My heart was beating faster than it should after the recent operation, but I tried to breathe deeply and evenly, as the doctors had advised. I stopped at the gate, looking around the house. The curtains were drawn, but Calvin's car was in the driveway, which meant they were home. I opened the gate and walked down the path to the porch, followed by Malcolm, the detectives, and the cops. I pressed the bell. Once, another, a third. Finally, the door opened, and Calvin appeared on the doorstep in homemade pants and a t-shirt, his hair disheveled, as if he'd just woken up. When he saw me surrounded by police officers, he froze with his mouth hanging open. "Dad, what's going on?" "Mr. Hawthorne?" Detective Foster approached him. "Detective Foster, Somerville Police. We have a warrant to search your home and detain you and your wife for questioning in a fraud and forgery case." Calvin turned pale, backed away. "What fraud? I don't understand." "Calvin, who's there?" Veronica's voice came from deep inside the house. She appeared in the hallway, tying the belt of her robe. When she saw us, she froze, and her face showed a range of emotions: surprise, fear, anger. "What's going on here?" she asked, quickly pulling herself together. "Why did you break into our house?" "This isn't your home, Mrs. Hawthorne," Detective Foster said calmly, producing the warrant. "We have evidence that the title to this house has been forged. We also have evidence of embezzlement from Ebenezer Hawthorne's bank accounts." "That's absurd!" Veronica was indignant, but there was a note of panic in her voice. "All the paperwork is legitimate. The house belongs to us." "Veronica," I interjected, looking her straight in the eye, "we know about your past in Oregon, about the other elderly people whose homes you stole." She flinched, and her mask of confidence cracked for a moment. Calvin turned to her, perplexed. "What is he talking about? What past?" "He's rambling," she said. "Don't listen to him." "The Portland detectives are on their way," I continued. "They want to ask you some questions about James Wilson and Martha Greenwood. Do you remember those names?" Veronica's face contorted with anger and fear. She turned sharply and rushed into the back of the house. One of the policemen immediately rushed after her. "Stay here, Mr. Hawthorne," Foster warned me, following the policeman. Calvin and I stayed in the hall, facing each other. He looked confused, scared, like a kid caught playing pranks. "Dad, I don't know what you're talking about," he began. "What people in Oregon? What forged documents?" "You really didn't know?" I asked, watching his reaction carefully. "You didn't know your wife was a con artist who specialized in defrauding the elderly?" "No," he shook his head. "She said you agreed to sign the house over to us for tax benefits. She showed me documents with your signature on them." "My signature was forged," I said, "and you must have realized it. You know my handwriting." He lowered his eyes, unable to meet my gaze. "Yeah, I wasn't looking closely. Veronica was doing the paperwork. I was just signed without reading," I finished for him. "Just letting her trick your father and steal the house you grew up in." At that moment, there was a rumbling, screaming sound from the back of the house, and then the police officers took Veronica out, putting her hands behind her back. She tried to break free, screaming something about her rights, about trespassing. Detective Foster was holding a laptop computer and several folders of documents. "They tried to burn the documents," he explained, pointing to an ashtray of charred papers. "Fortunately, they didn't have time." Veronica was led outside to the police car. Calvin watched with an expression of utter shock on his face. "Mr. Hawthorne," the second detective addressed him, "we need to ask you some questions. You can come with us voluntarily, or we'll have to detain you officially." Calvin gave me a desperate look, like he was looking for support. "Dad, I didn't know. I swear, I thought it was legal." I didn't answer. There had been too many lies in the last few days, too much betrayal. I couldn't believe his words anymore. Calvin understood my silence in his own way and, head down, walked out with the detective. The door closed behind them, and I was alone in the hallway of my house. "Are you okay?" Malcolm asked, putting a hand on my shoulder. I nodded, though my heart felt heavy. This was a bitter victory. My own son, my blood, had participated in the deception, even if he didn't fully realize the extent of it. "Detective Foster said you could stay here," Malcolm continued. "The judge lifted the restraining order. The house is yours again, though the legalities will take some time." "Ah, fine, Kareem. Thank you." I looked around the hall, noticing the changes they'd made this week. New furniture, different curtains, no pictures of Martha on the walls. "But I'm not sure I want to stay here." "I understand," he nodded. "You can stay at my place if you want. I have a spare room." I accepted his offer gratefully. I needed time to think about what had happened, to decide what to do next. Before leaving, I went up to my bedroom to get some of my personal belongings. The room was almost untouched. Apparently, they hadn't gotten to it yet. On the bedside table was the picture of Martha I'd kept all these years. I took it, wrapped it carefully in a handkerchief, and put it in my pocket. 3 days later, the first court hearing took place. Veronica was charged with fraud, forgery, and grand larceny. Calvin was also charged, but his attorney insisted that my son had been duped by his wife and was unaware of the illegality of their actions. I sat in the courtroom watching the proceedings with a strange sense of déjà vu. How many times in my career as a court clerk had I seen scenes like this? How many times had I heard the defendants' acquittals, their assurances of innocence? Veronica held herself cold and detached, refusing to admit guilt. Calvin, on the other hand, looked depressed and confused. Several times he tried to meet my gaze, but I looked away. After the hearing, as the defendants were being led away, Calvin suddenly burst toward me. "Dad, please listen to me. I didn't know what she was planning. She said it was for your own good, that it was best for everyone." The policeman pushed him away, but I could see tears in his eyes. For a moment, I felt doubt. Maybe he really didn't understand what was going on. Maybe Veronica was using him the way she was trying to use me. But then I remembered how he'd stood by her side in my house, how he'd remained silent when she'd kicked me out, how he'd averted his eyes when he'd lied. No, he wasn't an innocent victim. He'd made his choice. "I don't want to see him," I said to Malcolm as we walked out of the courthouse. "Never." "Are you sure?" he asked. "He's still your son." "He was," I said. "Now I don't have a son." Over the next few weeks, the case moved quickly. New evidence had come to light against Veronica. She had indeed been involved in a real estate fraud in Oregon, and now those old cases had been reopened. Calvin agreed to cooperate with the investigation, hoping for a reduced sentence. He told how Veronica planned their actions, how she forged documents, how she convinced him it was all for my benefit. The bank returned the stolen money to my accounts. The house was officially returned to my ownership. Life was slowly getting better, but there was an emptiness inside that nothing could fill. I often thought about Martha, about what she would say if she knew what our son had done. She had always believed in his goodness, always defended him when I was too strict. "He's just looking for himself," she'd say. "Give him time, and he'll find his way." But the path he chose led to betrayal and disgrace. 2 months after Veronica and Calvin's arrest, the trial took place. I attended every session, watching the trial unfold. Veronica was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 8 years in prison. Given his cooperation with the investigation and the lack of direct evidence that Calvin knew their actions were illegal, he was given probation and community service. After the verdict was announced, he tried to approach me, but I left the courtroom without waiting for him. I wasn't ready to talk, wasn't ready to hear his excuses and apologies. When I returned home, to a house that no longer felt like home, I sat in my chair for a long time, looking at Martha's picture. What should I do next? How to live with this pain, with this betrayal? The decision came unexpectedly, but as soon as it formed in my head, I realized it was the only right way. I called Malcolm. "I want to sell the house." "Are you sure?" he asked after a pause. "You've lived there most of your life." "That's exactly why," I answered. "There are too many memories, good and bad. I need to start over, in a new place." He understood and didn't argue. Over the next few weeks, we worked on selling the house. I gave most of the furniture and belongings to charity, keeping only the essentials and a few items dear to my heart. Pictures of Martha, her favorite vase, books we'd read together. The house sold quickly. The neighborhood was nice. And even though the building was in need of repair, a young family was found who saw the potential. I was excited that children's laughter would once again be heard within these walls, that the new owners would create their own happy memories here. With the money from the sale of the house, I bought a small apartment in downtown Somerville, not far from the park where Martha liked to walk. The apartment was bright, modern, without the burden of the past. The day I moved in, I received a letter from Calvin. It had been delivered to the old house and forwarded to my new address. I held the envelope in my hands for a long time, hesitating to open it. What could he have written that would change my decision not to contact him? Finally, I opened the envelope. The letter was short. Dad, I know you don't want to see me, and I understand why. I'm not apologizing because what I did is unforgivable. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. Every day, every minute, I regret my weakness for letting Veronica manipulate me, for not stopping her when I still could have. I will live with that regret for the rest of my life. If someday you decide you're ready to hear me out, I'll be waiting. Calvin. I folded the letter and put it in my desk drawer. Maybe someday I'd be ready to talk to him, but not now. The wounds were too fresh, the pain of betrayal too strong. My new life started out unexpectedly easy. I volunteered at the local library helping catalog books and doing readings for children. I met new people, some of whom became friends. Malcolm often stopped by to visit. We played chess and reminisced about the good old days in court. Sometimes I thought about Calvin, about how his life was turning out after everything that had happened. I even saw him from afar once. He was working in a city park, picking up trash, apparently as part of his community service. He'd lost weight, gaunt, and there was a touch of gray in his hair. For a moment I felt a prick of pity, but then I turned away and went on my way. 6 months passed. I was sitting on a park bench enjoying a warm fall day when my phone rang. The number was an unfamiliar one. Ebenezer Hawthorne speaking, I said. Mr. Hawthorne, this is Xavier from the hospital. Remember me? Came a young voice. Of course I remember, I smiled. How are you doing, Xavier? Fine, thank you. I'm calling because, well, I saw your son today. He came in for a checkup and I thought he looked really bad. Not physically, but, you know, I didn't know what to say. I'm sorry if I'm prying, Xavier continued. I just thought you should know. Thank you, I said at last. Yeah, think about it. I hung up the phone and sat for a long time, staring at the falling leaves. The thoughts of Calvin that I'd been trying to keep from me all these months came flooding back. I remembered him as a child, how I'd taught him to ride his bike, how I'd read him books at bedtime, how proud I'd been of his first successes in school. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that sooner or later I would have to decide if I could forgive my son. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. In the meantime, I had a new life, new friends, new goals. I survived heart surgery. I survived betrayal, the loss of my home and my son. And despite it all, I was still here, still breathing, still finding joy in the small things. In chess games with Malcolm, in the smiles of the kids at the library, in the warmth of the fall sun on my face. Life went on, and I was ready to face what it would bring next. With an open heart and a clear mind, no matter what.